Boston police officer John O'Keefe
was found face up in the snow
outside a home occupied by people known to O'Keefe.
Prosecutors accuse O'Keefe's girlfriend, Karen Reed, of backing into him and leaving him to die in the snow.
Lawyers for the woman not only say their client is innocent, they're alleging a cover-up.
There are a lot of issues in this case. We're looking at arm injuries with scratches. We're not looking at tire tracks.
The FBI is investigating an investigation that never happens.
People in this town are scared of the people who are supposed to protect and serve.
The trial of Karen Reed is underway.
There are more people here at the beginning of this than at the beginning of Johnny Depp's trial.
Jurors are coming and going with a police escort.
I've never seen anything like this.
It's a spectacle, that's for sure.
This is not a Hollywood star. This is an accused murderer getting a standing ovation as she enters the courtroom. What is going on out there?
We're about 6 weeks away from the second trial of Karen Reed, and already things are heating up big time. Every time I thought I was about done writing this episode, something else would happen and I'd be right back at my desk working on another update. The Supreme Judicial Court released their opinion, Karen Reed did an interview that aired on Super Bowl Sunday, and there's been a flurry of motions that have been filed. We also have a heated motions hearing to discuss, one where we hear about Brady violations and more Sallyport video that's suddenly showing up 3 years later. How is that happening? Plus, attorney Mark Betterow joins the defense team, and multiple jurors speak out about the Supreme Judicial Court decision. Emotions are definitely running high as we approach trial, and I might get a little fired up when we go over some of the stuff in this episode. We have a lot to cover, so let's jump right in. First, 2 quick updates. Number 1, Michael Proctor. There's still no update on disciplinary decisions for Proctor, although we will hear a little bit more about Proctor later in this episode. Proctor faced his second hearing with the State Police Trial Board this week and will face a third next month. It keeps dragging on, but I'll keep you posted. Next, an update on the defense expert Richard Green. In the last episode, we spent a lot of time going over the arguments from the Commonwealth on why Hank Brennan wants the testimony of digital expert Richard Green excluded from this trial. Now, I was very vocal about my belief that this is not a Daubert argument. It's a battle of the expert opinions. And Judge Canoni reviewed the motions and heard the arguments, and she started out the hearing on February 6th with her decision on this.
After review of the pleadings, it's clear to me that the issues that give rise to the dispute do not invoke the gatekeeper function of the court. To me, it's rather a difference of opinions that need to be resolved by the jury. So I'm denying your motion. I'm not going to exclude the evidence.
So, Brennan lost his motion to exclude expert testimony from Dr. Russell, and he lost his motion to exclude expert testimony from Richard Green. Now, in the hearing on February 6th, we were expecting to hear the arguments about the other 2 experts that Brennan has filed motions on, the ARCA experts, but that discussion was held at a sidebar, so we didn't get to hear most of what's going on with that yet. Although Brennan did say that he filed a voluminous amount of discovery, including some reports from crash reconstructionists. Then he referred to Dr. Daniel Wolf and Dr. Andrew Rentschler as the quote-unquote so-called ARCA experts. Now, this was not only disrespectful, but also really ironic considering who the Commonwealth put on the stand for the crash reconstruction in the last trial. You may not like that their conclusions don't fit your narrative, but the disrespect of calling them the so-called experts is misplaced and it's frustrating. They aren't so-called experts, they're experts. They're more experienced, more educated, more trained, and more qualified than any of the experts that the Commonwealth provided. The National Hockey League trusts ARCA experts to improve player safety. NASA trusts them to design and test systems for U.S. space shuttles. The U.S. military trusts them to design safer combat and air vehicles. And obviously, the U.S. Attorney's Office trusted them because they're the ones that hired them for this case. But by all means, tell us how these seasoned experts with professional credentials and extensive experience don't measure up to Pirouette Paul. On February 11th, the Commonwealth filed a motion to exclude the testimony of the ARCA experts, stating that the defense has not complied with the discovery obligations. Now, I went over some of this in episode 36. Basically, with ARCA being hired as a part of the federal investigation, there were limitations on the prosecution and the defense before the trial because they weren't able to contact the ARCA experts or talk to them about their reports or how they reached their conclusions. So the judge scheduled a voir dire where Lally and Jackson both got to ask their questions, get their answers, and the ARCA experts, affectionately referred to as the crash daddies, were able to testify. Good solution, worked out. Now, in trial 2, Brennan wants to exclude the ARCA experts just like he wanted to exclude all the other experts, even though the judge already allowed them in the last time, just like she already allowed in all the others that he has tried to keep out this go-round. So let's break this down just a little bit. The first issue is the inability to comply with discovery obligations. Now, the irony is not lost on me that the Commonwealth is arguing for discovery that they know the defense doesn't have, while also withholding discovery from the defense that they've had for 3 years. Brennan also does a lot of talking here about how there are discovery obligations that he's entitled to, and he doesn't want to be ambushed in trial. Kind of like how the Commonwealth ambushed the defense in last year's trial. And he says a voir dire isn't enough. Now, Brennan also mentions allowing the defendant ample time to hire her own experts. But here's the thing. She doesn't have to. These experts are incredibly clear, easy to understand, extraordinarily qualified, and most important, they're not hired by the defense, which actually gives their conclusions even more weight. It's an independent third party who is incredibly qualified saying, yep, that doesn't make sense. So why would the defense want to hire anyone else? And more importantly, why would they need to? Brennan also threw shade at the judge's prior ruling that the ARCA experts were allowed to testify, saying, quote, nonetheless, the court permitted them to testify on behalf of the defendant. Now, that's not accurate. They did not testify on behalf of the defendant. They were available to be called by either side. They were independent. And Dr. Wolf even says very specifically what their task was.
The entity that retained us in this asked us to evaluate whether or not the damage to the vehicle and the injuries to Mr. O'Keefe were consistent with the interaction or in interaction between the two.
And that's the whole thing. They were hired to see if the car could have caused John's injuries and if John could have caused the damage to the car. And they said no. That's why Brennan wants them excluded. Brennan also says in the motion that the ARCA experts didn't review all of the information before making their conclusions. But that's something that's left for cross-examination, not for excluding testimony. The things that they reviewed are the relevant things. And in this first trial, Lally even went down the list of all the things that he thought mattered that the ARCA experts didn't review. Basically, he went down the list of every single thing that he could think of that he believes makes Karen look guilty, pointing out that the doctors didn't consider those things in their testing.
There were about 10 items that you were provided that you reviewed, is that correct?
Correct.
And a number of different items that I just asked you about that you weren't provided with or you weren't aware of, correct?
Correct.
And again, in your report, in the very first paragraph, you indicate, however, ARCA reserves the right to supplement or revise this report if additional information becomes available, correct?
Correct.
But both experts were clear that none of those things would have changed their conclusions.
Does any of that change your opinion about your opinions and conclusions in this case?
Objection.
I'll allow that.
Absolutely not.
This will be argued in the hearing on the 18th, but I suspect the court will do a voir dire again because it is unfathomable that these experts could be excluded. Lawyer Joshua Schiffer said it best. Excluding them represents proactively hiding exculpatory information from the jury. And if a private citizen tried this during an investigation, they would get charged with obstruction. So let's get into the hearing from February 6th. The first argument that was done is for the defense's motion to recover funds spent on the expert who went out to Canton to download the surveillance video. Now, I went over both of these motions in last week's episode, so I'm not going to spend a ton of time rehashing what was already covered. But the arguments for this motion basically cue us up for another big motion that'll be coming up, and I'll explain that. The topic at hand for this specific hearing is whether or not the Commonwealth should have to reimburse the defense for the money spent sending their expert to Canton. Now, in order to make these arguments, defense attorney Alan Jackson gives the history or background of how we got to this point. Now, there are two separate issues, though they are greatly intertwined. But the discovery violations and the nonstop issues with the Sallyport video, that's a little more in-depth, so I'm going to get into all of that in a minute. This is something that we can expect to hear a lot more about. This isn't going away. But for now, let's take a look at just the argument about whether or not the defense should be reimbursed for the expert expenses. Now, Jackson argues that this is an issue of equity and fairness because Karen Reed has been expending precious resources for 3 years now. The Commonwealth has only turned over scraps and fragments of the Canton police videos, including footage that was not turned over until after the trial had already started, and even footage that has been turned over since the first trial ended. That's a huge problem, and the defense needs to know where all this extra footage is coming from. So they arranged to have this expert go out there because if they're getting all these random clips and pieces at different times, that means that there has to be something on the DVR. They're not just pulling these clips out of nowhere. So the expert gets there and there's nothing on the DVR system because it's set up to overwrite after 30 days. Okay, so where did this new video come from? How are you getting new video clips and bits and bytes when it overwrites after 30 days? Well, listen to Brennan during this hearing explaining this.
There was a backup hard drive which kept materials longer than that 30 days. I do know that there was materials on that DVR, MVR, back in July of 2024, and I know that from a report that was generated by the Commonwealth and given to the defense, so they should know that as well. That may be one reason why they want it to come out.
Okay, wait, what? There's a backup hard drive that keeps the video for more than 30 days? So where is it? Why couldn't the defense expert take a look at that when he flew there? And yeah, if it was something on that backup hard drive and the defense was told about it sometime after July, then of course it would absolutely make sense for them to arrange for an expert to fly out there a few months later and download everything. So where is that backup? And why wasn't that made available so it wasn't a wasted trip? Well, Brennan says that it wasn't until after the defense expert left that he went to the police department and talked to someone about this.
I learned there was no information on the NVR. I took the initiative and went to the police department. I viewed the police department, the cameras. I spoke to personnel and I spoke to the retired individual who then was responsible for providing video upon request.
So Brennan took initiative to go talk to these people after the defense expert had already come out there to download whatever video is available. And now there's a retired person who he has to speak to for video upon request. How is that even a thing? But it gets worse, and we are going to get into the mess that the Commonwealth has made with this evidence in a moment. But the main arguments that are being made by the Commonwealth in their opposition to having to pay for the defense's wasted trip is that Brennan says that he didn't lure him there and didn't guarantee him that anything would be there. He also said that he didn't know what would be on there when he arrived.
They came out on their own volition. I extended the courtesy as much as I could, made no promises. I was clear, I was very uncertain about what would be on there since I never looked at it.
Jackson says the Commonwealth has created a huge mess and is making Karen Reed pay for it.
What it is this entire situation surrounding this DVR and the Commonwealth's maintenance of that DVR and the footage on it is a complete dumpster fire, and Ms. Reed has to pay for the fire extinguisher.
Judge Canoni asked Alan Jackson if he and Brennan both expressed concern about the footage being gone.
Didn't both of you agree that it was highly unlikely it would still be there? Or are you saying that part's not true? Mr. Brennan told me that.
I said, I'm concerned if we don't get out there fast. I don't know what the override protocol might be.
So in her decision, when it comes to repaying the defense, Judge Canoni says that based on Brennan saying that Jackson had expressed concerns about the footage not being there anymore because of the time that had passed, and Brennan saying that he agreed and didn't know if it was there, she is denying the request for the Commonwealth to have to pay for those expert expenses. Now, I know some people disagree with this decision, and I get it. But since it's unclear what expectation the defense was given, I do understand the reasoning. However, there are a lot of things that should have been done differently. And although this motion was denied, it has opened up a whole new can of worms. Also, Karen Read supporters were able to come up with the $12,000 to donate to her defense fund on the same day that the request was denied. There are a lot of people who truly believe in her innocence and choose to donate to the cause. We'll be right back after this. Who doesn't love the good things in life? Even though I enjoy a little luxury, it doesn't mean that I can always afford it. That is, until I discovered Quince. Quince is my go-to for all of my luxury essentials at affordable prices. Quince offers a range of high-quality items at prices that are actually within my reach, like 100% Mongolian cashmere sweaters from only $50, washable silk tops and dresses, organic cotton sweaters, and 14-karat gold jewelry. And one thing I love just as much as luxury items is a good deal. And the best part of Quince is that all items are priced 50 to 80% less than similar brands. By partnering directly with top factories, Quince cuts out the cost of the middleman and passes the savings on to us. And Quince only works with factories that use safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing practices and premium fabrics. I love that. My absolute favorite thing from there is my aviator lenses. I love them and I get so many compliments on them. And I also just got the cutest European linen button front dress, and it is perfect for spring. Give yourself the luxury that you deserve with Quince. Go to quince.com/Brandi for free shipping on your order and 365-day returns. That's QUINCE.com/Brandi to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/Brandi. So, all of that opened the door to what is a much bigger issue. Let's take a look at what's really going on. Now, all of this started with Sallyport video problems, and there have been a lot of Sallyport video problems. Now, let's start from day one because y'all know I love a good timeline. Michael Proctor texted his sister that this was a homicide around 3 p.m. or so. An hour later, Karen's car is being put on a tow truck while Proctor and Buchanan are interviewing her at her parents' house. Karen Read was the only suspect. They didn't consider anyone else a person of interest. In fact, that night, Proctor is texting his buddies telling them, without having ever gone to the crime scene, that the homeowner won't receive any shit because he's a Boston cop, and saying that Karen Read, quote unquote, waffled him. When he's asked what that means, Proctor says, quote, "She hit him with her car," end quote. So, the lead investigator has decided sometime between when he took the case and about 10 o'clock that night that Karen Read is the one and only suspect and the car is the alleged murder weapon. And now, it is in the custody of Canton Police Department. Now, Massachusetts law states that it is mandatory, not suggested, not a courtesy, not a nice brotherly thing to do. It is mandatory to let the defense discover, inspect, and copy all intended exhibits, any material and relevant evidence. And the prosecution is required to notify the defendant of the existence of the evidence. Now, the condition of the car, since this is, of course, the alleged murder weapon, according to the lead investigator, is crucial to the case. So, it's taken to Canton Police Department. Canton Police, who are recused from the case, take control of the alleged murder weapon. There are how many cameras in Canton PD? Well, there's at least 2 inside the Sallyport, right? Plus some outside in different locations. Now, all of this video, and here it is, catching the alleged murder weapon being brought in directly after leaving the alleged murderer. Sergeant Sean Good testified that Canton Police Department doesn't investigate homicides.
It's a homicide. We do not investigate homicides.
You've been a Canton police officer for 18 years, correct?
Yes.
During those 18 years, do you know how many homicide investigations have occurred in Canton?
None.
None?
Homicides? No.
Wow. Okay. Well, call me crazy, but if you haven't had a homicide in Canton in at least 18 years, and the first one thrown your way is the alleged murder of a Boston cop, and you have the alleged murder weapon being brought right on into your Sallyport, I would think that would be precisely the kind of evidence that I'd be making sure I preserved. But wait. There's more. The car is being brought to Canton PD, but Canton PD, like I said, is recused from the investigation. All the more reason that everything needs to be documented and preserved, right? It doesn't end there. A Boston cop was found dead in the yard of Brian Albert, and it just so happens that Brian Albert's brother is a cop at, you guessed it, Canton Police Department. Also, Brian Higgins, who also has an office at Canton PD, was not only with the victim the night he died, but he was also at the house where the victim was found. And if that's not enough, he left that house around the time of John's death and went straight to the Canton Police Department. He was also in and out of the Sallyport, according to his key card, not just that night, but the next day. So you have the alleged murder weapon right smack dab in the middle of an area where there are all kinds of folks who are involved in some capacity in this case or have some kind of relationship to the people in this case. And you're going to try to tell me with a straight face that is not enough of a reason to know to preserve the video evidence? So let's say for some reason Canton PD missed all of that. On February 2nd, defense attorney David Yannetti filed a motion to preserve evidence. Jackson brought this up during the hearing.
We asked for the preservation on February 2nd, 2022, when Mr. Yannetti said retain and maintain all physical evidence. We've been seeking these videos since well before the first trial. We didn't get them before the first trial. It's in discovery request after discovery request after discovery request.
Let's put this in perspective. Karen Reed was arrested on February 1st, 2022. The very next day, February 2nd, David Yannetti puts together a preservation request, and that request is acknowledged by the judge and Adam Lally from the Commonwealth during Karen's arraignment.
Yes, on the motion, I have Mr. Lally, a motion for preservation of evidence. Have you had a chance to review it?
I have, yes, Your Honor.
Do you have any objection to it?
I do not, Your Honor.
All right, thank you. I'll allow that. It's 10:22 a.m. on February 2nd. That's when it's effective.
Thank you very much, Ron. In terms of a next date, could I have my...
So it should go without saying that evidence in a criminal trial is supposed to be preserved. That's obvious. But regardless, Yannetti filed the preservation request and it was approved and signed by the judge. Now, included in this request was all notes of any law enforcement about witness interviews, notes about the investigation, turret tapes, 911 recordings, all trace evidence, and this is the applicable part here, all physical evidence. Physical evidence includes, video recordings. Now, Brennan, who knows what physical evidence is, pretends not to.
I looked through the docket. There was no motion to preserve videotape. I read the pleadings. Attorney Yannetti was meticulous in his motions to preserve. It was admirable. It was meticulous, the work he did.
So let's just take after Brennan and play pretend for a minute. Let's pretend like the preservation request didn't include the request for, quote, all physical evidence, end quote. The Commonwealth and law enforcement still have a responsibility to preserve evidence in a criminal trial. And let's pretend like they didn't know that. Jackson explains that the defense still included a catch-all to get all footage, not knowing what was available.
Basically, there's also a catch-all. We've been asking for all physical evidence concerning video footage from Canton PD from well before the trial. We didn't specify which cameras because we didn't know which cameras had video footage. We didn't know how many cameras there were, but we didn't get anything.
A general catch-all request makes sense because how do you know what exists if you don't know it exists? Well, the answer should be that the prosecution has an obligation by law to let you know it exists, but Brandon's pretending like that obligation, along with the evidence, doesn't exist. So you have all these cameras and all this evidence, and somehow you don't turn it over to the defense. Now, Brennan claims that the Canton PD DVR system is set to delete recordings after 30 days. It writes over them. So anything that is going to be preserved would have to have been preserved sometime before the end of February 2022. Now, in that case, every piece of video that we have from the Sallyport and Canton PD should have been turned over to the defense sometime in early 2022 or by spring of last year at the very latest, because that's when trial started. But that's not what happened. The defense was handed scraps and clips of video here and there, some right before the last trial, some during the trial. They've even been handed some recently, after the first trial. So what would have happened if somehow Karen Read was convicted during the first trial, and here comes this video evidence that proves that one of the key witnesses lied on the stand and was at the police department on the phone right around the time of John's death, and was at the police department all day the next day, and was there when her car arrived? Nobody would have even known it existed. Now, if the system overwrites at 30 days, where is this new video coming from? A motion was filed in September of 2022 from the defense requesting photos and videos taken in connection with this case along with the metadata, and it was approved by the judge. Why did the defense never get that turned over? Instead, there have been scraps of videos with no metadata and weird issues like the most important time missing and inverted videos with timestamps that change color. And they wonder why the defense and a lot of the world are questioning the authenticity of it. Now, we hear from Brennan that there was another video that he found when he took over this case that hadn't been turned over to the defense.
When I entered this case in September and I began to look at discovery, I saw a video produced in August from the Canton Police Department, and we immediately turned it over to the defense.
Excuse me, what? You saw a video that was created in August and you turned it over to the defense? How is it created in August if the DVR overwrites after 30 days? So defense is finally just fed up with asking for the evidence that is continuously withheld from them. And they ask if they can have their own expert come download whatever there is. And Brennan agrees. Now, let's be clear here. This was an informal request, and the informal request was granted. If he had said no, then the defense could have filed a motion and done this the formal way, but the defense would still have been allowed access to whatever there is. But since apparently Brennan is on this big pretender kick, he's pretending again that somehow is so unheard of.
Seeing that there was an August videotape post-trial, I wanted to do what I could to accommodate them. So without any hesitation, despite that there was no court order, no motion to preserve.
That's not true, but carry on.
I invited him to come to the Canton Police Department. I called the chief of police. I asked the chief of police, although this was unique and novel, unprecedented, could the defense come and access their material?
Sir, let me tell you what is unique and novel and unprecedented. Y'all held on to video for 3 years that is supposed to be turned over. That's unique. You have absolutely no chain of custody for these random video fragments that are being turned over here and there as any random person just goes and happens to find them. That's novel. And you apparently have a retired guy that you found and talked to who made a copy of the entire January 29th footage, the footage that has never been turned over, to an iCloud account. That is unprecedented.
The Commonwealth has since told us, Mr. Brennan told us, that remarkably he went to Canton PD, and this is in his opposition paperwork in his declaration, and he spoke with some officer. And that officer told him that he, the officer, personally made a copy of the entire January 29th video footage and placed that copy in some sort of an iCloud account. Not on the DVR system, not in the official data bank in which it's supposed to be stored, but on some iCloud account. And we're finding out about this in 2025. It's outrageous.
How is there a full copy that was never turned over? And why is it on an iCloud account from someone at Canton PD who is recused from the case? And if there's a full copy, why is one video missing 42 minutes at the exact time that the car was pulled into the Sally Port? And why have the rest of the clips not been turned over? And how is this just now coming up 3 years and one full trial later? So, Brennan says that he began trying to account for video and chain of custody.
The defense asked me to try to account for the video because they believed it had been an issue in this case.
When he says they believed the video had been an issue in this case, I think what he meant is the entire world was watching, and we all know that the video has been an issue in this case. He said that's when he went to Canton PD and ended up talking to this retired sergeant who told him this.
He told me in conversation that he would routinely store a copy on a file he noted as a detective file or on his hard drive. That was news to me. I thought that was helpful, so I notified the defense about my conversation.
So Brennan lets the defense know that now suddenly they have found this file. The defense, who is obviously skeptical because of what has been done with this evidence so far, asks that they are able to download it or access it at the same time as the Commonwealth or whoever. They just want one of their experts or someone representing the defense to be present. For good reason. But Brennan still basically denies there being any major issue here.
The defense waited almost 3 years, and now they stand before the court and they try to parlay this into some type of injustice for their cause.
The defense did not wait 3 years. The defense has been asking for all video evidence for 3 years, and somehow they keep getting more scraps. And that is an injustice.
This is the government providing information as the case progresses and evolves and changes and retools.
The case should not be evolving to the point where you're getting new evidence that has already been requested years before. But continue.
So what we have now is information, supposedly, on a database that we are going to get and give to the defense. You should deny their motion. Nobody was misled in this case. They've taken a professional courtesy and an effort to help, and they've distorted it into some type of injustice.
Brennan says the defense is not entitled to download the Canton PD video. But if they had turned it over like they're supposed to, it wouldn't be an issue in the first place. The whole scenario gets me really fired up. So what is happening with this chain of custody? And how is this even a possibility? How is this happening? The footage and the metadata and the logs of who accessed everything matters. And if that's gone, there should be consequences for that. But some sergeant who is now retired made a copy and somehow nobody knows anything about it, but only clips here and there, and everyone ignores the defense when they request it over and over. How is that okay? And how are we having so many issues with the chain of custody here with everyone pointing to everyone else? We'll be right back after this. Obviously, having a true crime podcast means I'm pretty into the whole sleuth thing. Even when I'm not doing it for work, I'm doing it to relax. That's why my new favorite game on my phone is June's Journey. It's free to download, and you have to find hidden objects in each scene. But the scenes are beautiful. You have a mansion on a garden island that you can customize and remodel as you go. And it's all really colorful, and it has this really cool 20s type style. There's always something going on, and you progress through the story to get to the next chapters. The one that I'm on right now is, of course, a murder mystery. There are also events you can do along the way that earn you additional in-game prizes. You can play alone or join a club where they have special competitions. I enjoy playing when I'm trying to wind down after writing, researching, or recording all day. I get excited trying to find the hidden objects in time so that I can get my next clue. And I'm always wanting to get to the next part. Plus, it really helps me wind down without feeling like just a mindless, time-wasting game. You can download June's Journey for free by clicking the link in the podcast description. June's Journey is available on iOS and Android mobile devices, as well as on a PC. Proctor has asked her in the first trial if he retrieved any of the Sallyport videos, and he says no.
How did those Sallyport videos end up in the possession of the Commonwealth? What was the line of succession?
Detective Lieutenant Tully retrieved
The Sallyport videos, I believe.
And do you know from whom he retrieved those Sallyport videos?
I believe it was the chief of police.
Okay, Chief Rafferty specifically gave him whatever videos were provided.
Correct, that's my understanding.
And then he provided those to you for your review.
Yes.
Okay, so he got them from Tully, who got them from Chief Rafferty at Canton PD. So if Chief Rafferty had the clips, she had to have known where they came from. And Brennan said that before the defense expert came, he spoke to Chief Rafferty directly about this. So what's the problem? There are still other questions about this chain of command, but let's try to take a look at the two videos from the interior of the Sallyport. Now, the first one is the really grainy, hard to see one. It's the one that's missing the big chunk of time where Karen's car is brought into the Sallyport. It's dark, it's grainy, it's hard to see, but it's also missing this important chunk of time, which Lally explained is because the cameras are motion activated. I guess a big full-size Lexus SUV moving directly into the stall that the camera covers doesn't count as motion in Canton. Right. So Tully was asked about when he received that video.
When did you receive that video, if you can tell us?
Which one? The grainy one?
The grainy one.
So if you got that early on in the investigation, why did it not get turned over until the month that the trial started? Now let's talk about the inverted video. That one didn't get turned over until after the trial had already started. And Tully says he made a request to Chief Rafferty at Canton PD to burn another copy of all the footage from January 29th. And he did that just within the last couple of months, as in around the time that the trial was starting. So Chief Rafferty dropped off a thumb drive, and that's where the inverted video came from. But he didn't notice it being inverted. Buchanan said it was the way that it was the way that it was given to him from Canton. But it makes me wonder a couple things. Number one, why of all the videos is that the only one that's inverted? And number two, if Tully asked Chief Rafferty to burn him a copy of all footage from January 29th, where's that copy? Where's the rest of it? Where's that thumb drive that she dropped off? And why doesn't the defense have it? So let's keep going. Proctor says on the stand that Tully got the video and he watched it on his own from the drive or disc or whatever it was. He said that the way he saw it, the video was oriented properly, but instead of the blue timestamp at the bottom, it was an inverted yellow timestamp. That's different. The defense asks if he's watching the videos that were admitted in the trial, like in the defense exhibit. The whole thing is just a mess with no answers about anything. So Tully said the copies of the videos are held in the DA's office or on the DA's server, and everyone denies having anything to do with anything. The other issues that we've heard with Sallyport videos also came out during the trial. We first learned that Proctor revealed for the first time in front of a federal grand jury in February of 2024 that there was more Sallyport video footage, and he said he had seen it. Now remember, this was a couple months before the last trial, so that new footage is now part of what was turned over. At least we think so. But it had not been turned over to the defense at that point, despite many requests for all footage. And at the time in February of 2024, when he went in front of this federal grand jury, he said that he hadn't reviewed that footage in quite some time. So how long had they had it before they finally turned it over? He also said in that federal grand jury that they review all video, but out of 360-something videos, somehow the Sallyport video is the only one that was withheld? Why do things like that keep happening in this case? We can expect to see a big motion to discuss this coming up in the near future, and it'll be a big topic. Another big topic that will be discussed in that motion, the videos that were just recently turned over.
We got another Sallyport video just a few days ago. This one showing the Lexus backing into the Sallyport from some exterior camera. And that also is exculpatory evidence.
Backing in? Since when is there video of the car backing in? When is that from? The video that we saw of it being pulled into the Sallyport, it was being pulled in by the tow truck driver. So who backed it in? In the other video that they got recently, Brian Higgins is seen arriving at the Canton Police Department at 1:26 a.m. He's on the phone as he's walking out of the Canton Police Department at 1:34 a.m.
It was raised at trial, and Brian Higgins never once, not once, on direct examination or on cross-examination, admitted to having made a phone call in the middle of the night on January 29th. And yet now, after the trial, we get a video of him doing exactly that. And that also proves that he lied in front of a federal grand jury, when he testified that he didn't have or make any phone calls in the middle of the night. That is called exculpatory evidence. And that's Brady evidence, and it was withheld in its entirety during the first trial and for the last 3 years.
So Higgins, who had those inappropriate texts with Karen Reed and who said something about the plow on his Jeep hitting or scraping something when he was leaving Fairview, left around the same time that John died, and then went to the Canton Police Department and was seen on the phone in evidence that was withheld from the defense, and then lied to a federal grand jury, never admitting that he did in fact make a phone call in the middle of the night. This doesn't look good at all. At minimum, this is impeachment. Jackson says it's exculpatory and it's a Brady violation. The judge may agree because when he brings up Brady later, she says, "You're talking about the Higgins part, right?" Now, this will all be in the upcoming motion to dismiss, and I expect that to be a very interesting and very detailed motion. Also, I wonder if Lally is going to have to testify in the hearing for the motion to dismiss. Someone has to explain why there are videos missing. And Tully said that those videos were delivered and kept in the DA's office. That would be interesting to see the assistant DA have to testify about that. But I don't know how they can get around it since, like I said, someone's going to have to answer to this. That will be coming up soon. As the hearing continued, Brennan asked for an entire data copy of the forensic download of Karen Reed's phone, which he says he didn't get. He only got the PDF. Must be so frustrating not to get the data that you've requested that you're entitled to. Poor guy. There's no objection from the defense to this. This is all covered under previous warrant, so there's no issue there. Then there's a discussion about the discovery. The Commonwealth said that they just turned over voluminous discovery that morning, including 12 to 15 new categories of information, multiple experts, and crash reconstructionists. It looks like this is not going to be a second take of the first trial. This is going to be all new people saying all new stuff, and that will be really interesting. We'll be right back after this. All right, y'all, they have been busy in Norfolk County. There are a ton of new motions that have been filed getting ready for this new trial. Now, a lot of these are going to be argued on the 18th, so I want to kind of go over some of what we expect to hear and some of what the arguments are now. So we went through a lot with the defense getting the testimony of Dr. Russell approved. Again, for this trial. Now, Dr. Russell is a medical doctor who has given the expert opinion that the abrasions on John O'Keefe's arm are from a dog. Now, the Commonwealth has an expert named James Crosby from Jacksonville, Florida, who they want to introduce in trial to tell the jury his expert opinion. And his expert opinion is that the marks are not from a dog. Now, it's great to have opposing opinions so that the jury can hear both sides and decide for themselves. However, James Crosby is not a medical doctor, and Massachusetts law states that only medical doctors can give opinions about the causation of injuries.
In Massachusetts, biomechanical engineers are not qualified to testify as to medical causation of an injury. Only an MD can do that.
So, Crosby has a PhD, so he is Dr. Crosby, but he's not a medical doctor. So, while he may have a ton of great knowledge, by law in Massachusetts, he can't give an opinion on the cause of injuries. He has a Master of Science and a PhD in veterinary medical science, but he's not a doctor of veterinary medicine or an odontologist. Dr. Crosby acknowledges in his report that he's not a physician, but he argues that this case is not about the treatment of John O'Keefe's injuries. Well, I mean, that's obvious. Nobody has testified to treatment because that's a moot point. The testimony is about what caused it or what could have caused it, not how to treat it. Dr. Crosby says that he reviewed images, reports, and apparently Chloe herself to determine if the injuries were consistent with the dog bite. His opinion is that the injuries could not have been caused by Chloe or any other large dog. So defense attorney Alessi argues that Dr. Crosby's title is Certified Behavior Consultant. So his focus is on animal behavior and aggression, not on medical causation or injuries in people. Also, there are, of course, questions about methodology. And Alessi says in the motion that Dr. Crosby does not allege, let alone establish, that his purported methodology is generally accepted in the relevant medical community. Now, Alessi says Dr. Crosby's report is based heavily on odontology matters, even though Dr. Crosby is not an odontologist or a veterinarian. Regardless, forensic odontology is heavily questioned when it comes to reliability. Saying that a bite mark is from a human or from a dog, that's one thing, but matching it up to one specific human or one specific dog, that is often considered junk science. So the Commonwealth's expert can't exclude a specific dog or any large dog from being the medical cause of a wound to a person because, according to Alessi, that's unreliable. Now, Alessi points out that Lally even said it's unreliable when he asked Dr. Russell about it, so they can't really jump in now and say, oops, never mind, JK. Now, the defense included an affidavit from Dr. Russell, and she uses her expertise and medical knowledge to combat some of what is said in Dr. Crosby's report. For instance, she points out that Dr. Crosby refers to the wounds as defects, and she says never in her career has she heard of someone refer to wounds on a person as defects. And she also says she's never seen someone who isn't a medical doctor try to determine the cause of an injury to a person. Dr. Russell lists a lack of qualifications for Dr. Crosby and points out that he's not licensed in any medical or scientific field and doesn't have any professional license. He doesn't list any training or education in any kind of forensic examination on humans and didn't work with a forensic pathologist or medical examiner. She also points out that Dr. Crosby said in his report that particularly at question is whether the wounds came from Chloe or any other large dog. But then he kind of strays from that and gives the opinion that the wounds on John O'Keefe's arm are consistent with the engagement of some sort of sharp or semi-sharp object. Now, he doesn't have any kind of qualification listed that would allow him to give that opinion. So we can already assume that that's completely going to be out. But Dr. Russell says that only medical doctors are qualified to make that claim, and she is one such medical doctor. Dr. Russell also explains the flaws in the methodology, and there's a lot. Now, I'm not going to dive too much into the methodology because I have a feeling we may end up having to do a hearing on this, so we may be hearing this argument a lot more in the future. But I do want to point out a few highlights. Dr. Russell says that Crosby's report is defective scientifically and medically, and she says wound analysis is specialized. The human body is not hard plastic. Skin is soft. It has elasticity and compressibility. And that has to be considered because wounds change as a result of the bunching and dimpling of skin. Plus, the environment and what's happening around matters, like movement of body parts and flexing of muscles. All of these things have to be taken into consideration when analyzing wounds. And she says that Dr. Crosby didn't do that. Dr. Russell goes on to say that the directional arrows that Dr. Crosby inserts in the picture of the decedent are actually going in the wrong way of how the wounds were inflicted. So because of that, his measurements are all off. And he doesn't account for the partial or incomplete bite scenario that's present in the wounds. And he wrongly assumes both of the jaws of the dog would be making compressions as opposed to glancing bites against the skin. Finally, Dr. Russell says that forensic photography requires proper qualifications and training, and she points out that there is at least one picture that is distorted and not a depiction of reality. Now, we've seen this in trials before. This is important for measurements. Think about it like this. When you see someone taking a selfie, how are they holding the phone? Usually up and out, right? Because it's a better angle. Now, if you have your phone kind of in your lap and you accidentally turn on your camera, think of that angle. Your chin looks way bigger and distorted, and it's not an accurate depiction of how you actually look. The way that things are photographed will change how things are measured. Finally, Dr. Russell addresses the dog DNA. She says that Dr. Crosby makes a big deal about the absence of dog DNA on the clothing, and he believes that supports the absence of a dog bite. Now, y'all already know how I feel about this. The absence of this dog DNA is not strong evidence, and Dr. Russell agrees, pointing out all of the reasons for that, like the arm itself wasn't swabbed, and John O'Keefe's clothes were basically thrown all over the place, like the ground, on the floor, on the ambulance floor, on the hospital floor, butcher paper for a few days, etc., etc. Plus, the swabs of the clothing weren't done properly. I'm really interested to hear this argument about this witness. But Massachusetts law is very clear that unless you're a medical doctor, you're not going to be able to testify about the causation of wounds. I'm sure that some of Dr. Crosby's testimony will be allowed in, but it's hard to say in what capacity. What is it that he can offer as an expert that he's qualified to say? He sounds like he's very qualified in certain fields with dog behavior and aggression, but that specialized area doesn't really apply here, so it will be interesting to see what he can offer the jury. Next up, the defense is asking the court to give them access to Karen's car and John's car, as well as access to the driveway at John's house to conduct some accident reconstruction type testing. Now, they're basically wanting to do crash reconstruction for what happened the morning when Karen pulled out of the garage and backed into John's car. They're expecting it to be about a 2-hour process, and they have a specific list of what they'll need. Now, the motion also said that the Massachusetts State Police decided to do some of this testing on their own without letting the defense know. And they had John's brother, Paul O'Keefe, and his friend, Brendan Kane, both present. Now, I'm assuming that he was present because he was giving them access to the house and to John's car, since John's car is not in the possession of the Commonwealth. But the bigger issue here is that they didn't let the defense know. Now, I feel like the right thing to do would have been to let the defense know so that they could have access at the same time so they didn't have to go through all of this again. Now, it doesn't seem really fair if you think about it for one side to have access to do all of the testing that they want, but the other side isn't allowed access to do their own testing. And how do you cross-examine a witness on something that you aren't able to test yourself? So the defense asked the Commonwealth to request access to John's car and to the driveway of the O'Keefes, but they were told to go through the process of filing this motion before the court. So this is that motion, and we'll hear more about this at the hearing. Moving right along, the defense also filed a motion for all chain of custody logs, reports, evidence logs, and any other documentation about how the DA's office and the state police got each of those little Sallyport video clips that have been delivered in bits and bytes at all different times. Now, they need to know where they came from, who had their hands on them, and why the heck there's no answers when they ask these questions. They are also requesting an unredacted copy of the state police report into Sandra Birchmore's death. Now, I've mentioned Sandra Birchmore before. She was found dead in her apartment by Canton police. Sandra was seeing married officer Matthew Farwell, who had been grooming and sexually assaulting Sandra since she was a child. She was pregnant with his child, though he had another child due at the time with his wife. Sandra's death was ruled a suicide. They determined that she hung herself on her bedroom door. But her family and friends said there's no way. She was too excited about the birth of the baby coming up. Norfolk DA's office screwed everything up, basically, and the U.S. Attorney's Office got involved, thank goodness, because Farwell was recently arrested for Sandra's murder and is now facing a federal murder charge. Now, there's a lot of corruption and a lot of mess that was uncovered through Sandra's case, and a lot of the people involved in that investigation are, not surprisingly, also involved in the investigation into John O'Keefe's death and the case against Karen Reed. So the defense asked Brennan for a copy of this unredacted report in November, noting that many of the material witnesses are the same, like Sergeant Lank, Kevin Albert, Trooper Gorino, Lieutenant Tully, Colleen Crawford, Daniel Whitley, Trooper Dunn, Trooper Clark, Lieutenant Fanning, and DA Beeland and DA Michael Morrissey. Now, given the similar allegations of misconduct by the same people, the defense says the report is relevant because it deals with their credibility, and it may be used for impeachment. A lot of things have come out about these people and their role in the Sandra Birchmore case disaster since the last trial. So that can be used at Karen's next trial. For example, Trooper Guarino, perfect one to talk about because he loses a lot of credibility in the eyes of a lot of people here. He did the cell phone extraction for Sandra Birchmore's case and didn't find any communication between Sandra and Farwell. But then when the feds got involved, suddenly there are 30,000 text messages between Sandra and the cop who killed her. So the defense asked Brennan for the report, and Brennan, who said in court how he does everything he can to help everyone and give over everything and be transparent, etc., he said no. He said, go ask the U.S. Attorney's Office. Then he said he doesn't have it and references an ongoing defense motion that doesn't actually exist. But Brennan does have them because he's the Commonwealth, and the Commonwealth will have that, especially since the witnesses listed are members of the prosecution team. Oh, Brennan. All right, defense also asked for Proctor's internal affairs investigation and transcripts. Brennan has only turned over a small number of generic letters about the IA investigation and a generic report that basically just says that Proctor's been suspended. Brennan says that's all he has right now. So the defense is trying to see what he has and what else they can get. Now, they also want relevant communications between law enforcement and witnesses, including between Buchanan and Chris Albert. So here's the deal with this one. They're bringing up the whole rubber ducky situation where Chris Albert contacted Buchanan and said that there was something threatening happening at the pizza place because there were two women outside taking pictures, and then one of them made a gun motion to her head, and then right after that launched this whole Ducky Gate thing. So Chris Albert recorded the whole situation, and Buchanan said to email it to him, so he did, and then Buchanan did a report about this being witness intimidation because Chris Albert is a witness in this murder trial. So the defense is saying that this was obviously a very informal type of communication, and the fact that he's comfortable texting communications that are related to his being a witness in a murder case means that there are likely more communications. That text should have been turned over when this happened, but apparently it wasn't, so now they want the rest of it. The defense is also asking for all notes and correspondence about any testing done for this case and all the info from the experts, communication with experts and law enforcement and DA's office, communication with the witnesses, and a legible copy of a report that had some texts that was turned over. Again, we'll hear more about this at the hearing. All right, next. I told y'all there's a lot. They've been busy and they've kept me busy, y'all. So the defense filed a motion to reconsider a reciprocal discovery order. So here's the deal with this one. In the last trial, the court ordered that Karen's defense team had to turn over all evidence that was going to be used to impeach the witnesses. So everything that proves that a witness lied, they had to turn over if they were planning on using it to show that the witness lied. I don't think I've seen this in trials before. I'm sure that there are jurisdictions that require it, but it's not something I remember seeing. Because if you're going to impeach someone, you impeach them. There are rules on how to do it. There's improper ways that aren't allowed, but I can't remember seeing a court force you to turn it over in advance before trial. But they did here, and of course that creates all kinds of problems. So the defense says they turn over all of this information, and then suddenly the witnesses get on the stand, and now their testimony is tailored to include details that had not been previously discussed to account for the evidence that the defense had to turn over. So basically, if they know that you're going to get caught in a lie because of this one thing, then all of a sudden they're providing extra information or changing information to accommodate for that thing so that you can't get caught lying. So they gave a couple of examples. One is Jen McCabe's testimony. So you'll remember during trial when Jen McCabe testified that she went to Sergeant Lank's house the day after John O'Keefe died. Well, Jen had been asked directly before about her meetings and conversations in those days, but she had never disclosed that. This is something that the defense was going to impeach her on. So during the meeting at the DA's office, she said she met with Lally and Lieutenant Tully and a couple others, but she was specifically asked about going to Lank's. They knew that the defense was going to use that against her because the defense had her phone data, so they had her location. So now it's brought up during this meeting in the DA's office, and now suddenly she's prepared at trial to volunteer that information during cross-examination. Jackson asked if anything significant happened that day. It's a very open-ended question. And suddenly she gives a detailed response about how she went by there and his wife came out and was consoling Carrie and they're all friends and she didn't go in. But then it was like, well, maybe I went in to go to the bathroom, whatever. The defense knew that Jen McCabe had gone to Lang's, and that open-ended question was specifically because that's where he was going with this. But now she suddenly prepared on how to answer that. When asked why she had never disclosed that before, she said she never thought much of it. But okay, if your friend is found dead and the next day you're at the home of the first officer who went into the house where your friend was found dead and you don't think much of it, you're literally proving the point that so many of us have been making since the beginning. You can't try to distance yourself on one hand and then just be chilling at each other's houses and besties with all the family members on the other hand. The whole point that the defense has been making is how close this entire group is and why there's so many issues. But regardless, this is why impeachment evidence shouldn't have to be turned over. And another thing that shouldn't have to happen, kids shouldn't have to testify unless it's absolutely necessary. But in the first trial, the niece and the nephew of John O'Keefe were brought in to testify. This is another one of the examples given about the impeachment evidence being used against the defense. They believe that Lally or someone from the DA's office coached John's nephew. Now, his nephew was 11 years old when John passed, and he was interviewed a few weeks after John's death. He was asked about Karen, and he said during this interview that there was a time when she got really mad at him because he had steak tips that were hard to chew, and it was taking him a long time to chew them. So she got really mad because she thought that he didn't like them, and he was spoiled. Now, the defense apparently had a video of Karen and the nephew, and he was eating the steak tips, and he and Karen were interacting in a playful way. She wasn't mad. It was just a regular interaction. So the defense had this and was planning on giving this as evidence that this thing that was said in the interview isn't actually what happened. So fast forward 2 years later, the nephew is 13 and is called to testify. Yannetti tells the judge in a sidebar that he's uncomfortable with this line of questioning that Lally is going down because he turned over the video that impeached that story, showing Karen as playful instead of angry. And because he had turned that over, he was concerned that the testimony would now change to accommodate that. So then what's he supposed to do? He can't say, oh, you're lying. I mean, this is a 13-year-old kid who's been through so much. So basically, he's just going to have to kind of let it happen. So he expressed his concern, and then he says, sure enough, a few minutes later, Lally asked the nephew if there were any times that he was yelled at by the defendant. The nephew said one time they got takeout food, and he was taking a little while to eat it, and the defendant thought that he didn't appreciate it, so she got mad at him. So the defense suggests that the prosecution coached the nephew. So they are asking for this trial to not have to turn over their evidence of impeachment because they don't want the witnesses prepped on how to avoid it. I think that's fair. I think it's how it should be, and I don't even know why this is a question. But things are different in this court system. And finally, Proctor's texts have made it back into court filings. Toward the end of the last trial, Proctor apparently texted Adam Lally and said, quote, "Yeah, I didn't watch Asshole Jackson's closing for good reason. Like all of us, the anticipation and anxiety of the verdict has us all on edge," end quote. So the defense suggests that this is evidence that Proctor violated the witness sequestration order, which means witnesses aren't allowed to watch the trial, and that the prosecution knew about it since the text was sent to Lally. So they'll argue this at the hearing also. If the sequestration order was still in effect, it could be a big problem. If it wasn't, then Proctor would be considered free to watch, like how Brian Albert and Jen McCabe were free to come to the closing arguments, even though that apparently intimidated some of the jurors. I'm interested to hear what they have to say here, so we will hear more about it next week. But if nothing else, this being thrown in there is a message to Proctor from the defense that they know he's still talking crap. All right, last few updates in the huge pile of updates that we had to get through after just 1 week. Attorney Mark Betterow has officially joined the defense team for Karen Reed. I've mentioned Betterow before. He's also the attorney for Aidan Carney, and he's been on my YouTube channel with me multiple times, breaking down some of the Karen Reed hearings and some of the mess that's happening there, giving some great legal insight. Bettero is a legal force to be reckoned with, and I'm excited to see what he brings to this already stellar team of attorneys. And finally, the Supreme Judicial Court has issued their ruling. They have denied Karen Reed's appeal, which means the next trial is definitely happening. There have been a few jurors from the trial who were asked about their thoughts on the decision. One juror told WBZ's Christina Rex that the truth is the jury was unanimously not guilty on the murder charge and on count 3, and some of them even signed affidavits swearing to that. But the truth and the legal process appear to be in conflict here, and this ruling shows that the legal process trumps the truth. That's really sad. The juror also said that the jurors didn't know what they didn't know, so how could they have known that they needed to make it clear that they were only hung on the second charge? And they didn't realize it was going to lead to an immediate mistrial without any further interaction or clarification from the judge. Another juror also spoke out and said the following, quote, "After serving as a juror in the Karen Reed trial and seeing the chaos that has unfolded since, it is clear to me that the criminal justice system in Massachusetts needs some work. Despite being one of the most progressive states in the nation, so many aspects of our criminal process are antiquated, confusing, and need to be updated. It would not infringe on the role of the jury to require all trial judges to provide clear instructions that help jurors comprehend all aspects of the job that they are tasked with. Similarly, it would not intrude on the jury's function or the sanctity of the deliberative process to require a uniform process for delivering verdicts and verdict slips, particularly in cases involving multiple count indictments. Making these kinds of changes to ensure criminal defendants receive a fair trial seems like the bare minimum our courts owe to those whose liberty is on the line." End quote. And a third told Aidan Carney, quote, "It's too bad that the directions were ambiguous and the foreman led the group to believe it had to be all or nothing." End quote. The Norfolk DA's office declined a comment on the ruling, but Karen's attorney, Martin Weinberg, released the following statement. Quote, "While we have great respect for the Commonwealth's highest court, double jeopardy is a federal constitutional right. We are strongly considering whether to seek federal relief from what are violations of guaranteed constitutional rights." Also, Karen did an interview with Boston 25 that aired on Super Bowl Sunday, and we'll go over some of that in the next episode. Before it even aired, Brennan had already filed a motion to get all that footage and everything from that interview as well. The hearing on the 18th will probably be pretty spicy, so next week's episode will be full of new information and probably a lot of snark, if we're being honest. This case is one of those that just gets to me. I don't know what happened, and I don't pretend to, but I know that the Commonwealth isn't doing things the right way. I know that law enforcement didn't do things the right way, and I know that there are a lot of very unlikable witnesses in this trial. It feels like there has apparently always been this tight-knit group that could kind of do as they please and not have it questioned. And now, as we're shining light on it and the world is watching, instead of making changes or doing things differently or taking responsibility, they're doubling down. And instead of trying to seek justice, the Commonwealth is looking for a win. With this many issues and this many problems with the evidence and the people involved and the investigation and everything else surrounding this, I don't see how anyone could think that there's not reasonable doubt. What the Commonwealth is saying happened is not the only thing that could have reasonably happened. And that means a not guilty verdict. It has nothing to do with who you think did it. It's only that. Is the Commonwealth's theory the only reasonable thing that could explain this evidence? And it's not. Their theory is actually contradicted by some of the evidence and especially by expert testimony. There are people who are angry and obsessing over how much Karen Reed spends on dinner or a jacket, when the anger should be directed at the officials who allowed things to get to this situation. Think about it like this. Based on what we've seen, how much trust do you have in that Commonwealth? And in the law enforcement in this case? How much faith do you have in their theory? Let's say you vote guilty. And if she really is guilty, then she spends the rest of her life in prison. But if you were wrong and she's innocent, then you would have to spend the rest of your life in prison. Would you still vote guilty? Would you risk it? If you aren't willing to bet your life on it, you shouldn't be willing to bet hers.
My name is Brandi Churchwell, creator of 13th Juror Podcast.
If you're enjoying it, please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, and share this episode with your friends. For more information, photos, and episode guides, visit our website at 13thjurorpodcast.com.